I'm Olivia Thorne, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Delaware County. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the candidate forum for the US Congressional Districts 5 and 7 with Mary J. Scanlon and Pearl Kim. This event is sponsored by the League of Women Voters and the NAACP. After the Supreme Court directed the legislature to withdraw the congressional districts in Pennsylvania, several changes have to take place. First, Representative Meehan resigned from the district in mid-2018, so there's an empty seat. And since we're represented by the 7th district in Congress until mid-2019, we must vote for a representative in Congress to finish out Meehan's term. We must also vote for District 5 representative who will represent us starting in mid-January 2019. On the ballot, and many people keep asking me, what's going to happen on the ballot? We're going to have two things to vote for. If you lived in District 7 prior to the redistricting, you'll be asked to vote for both the District 5 and 7. And under the heading, Representative in Congress, District 5, the ballot will state, vote for one. But under the heading, Representative in Congress, District 7, the ballot will state, vote for one special election. Unexpired term. It is most important to vote once for District 5 for the new term and a second time for District 7 to fill out the vacant period between November 2018 and January 2019. And Mary J. Scanlon and Pearl Kim are both running for seats on both ballots. So you'll see their names twice on the ballot, but you need to vote twice. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan civic organization. The mission of the League is to encourage knowledgeable and active participation in government, to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. We do not tell who or what party to vote for or whom to support. Our goal today is to have you learn about the candidates so you can make informed, thoughtful choices on November 6th. In the spirit of nonpartisanship, we request your compliance with the League standards of conduct for candidates' forums. First, please turn off your cell phone, and no camera, please. You will see a few pictures being taken by the press with the understanding that they need this in order to be able to report on this tonight, so we want them to do that, and they've been given permission. No applause during the event. No signs in the room or campaign shirts. No political flyers or handouts. And please be respectful of others in both speech and behavior. This forum is being professionally videotaped. It's being streamed right now on PCN TV and can be viewed tomorrow on lwvcdc.org and lwvdelcopa.org. You may also see it on PCN TV on Sunday on Channel 9 for Verizon and Channel 10 for Comcast.
Tight squeeze.
In an agreement reached with the candidates, they'll be the only videos for this event. So please, no filming or using any video during the forum. Now I turn this over to Heidi Gold, who will be our moderator, who will now explain all the rules. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Heidi.
Good evening. Thank you for coming, everyone. Okay, in terms of format, each candidate will have 2 minutes to make an opening statement. The candidates have met beforehand and agreed that Ms. Kim will begin, and then Ms. Scanlon will follow. Questions will be answered in the same rotation. In terms of questions, candidates will have 1 minute to respond to questions put to them by you, the audience, via your cards that we're painstakingly going through to make sure that we can get every topic covered. And you can see League members are screening the questions, and they're being screened for relevance to the office that these two women seek, and that's the 5th Congressional District. We have a League timer who will hold up a yellow card to indicate that there is 30 seconds. So candidates, make sure that you look, and when you see the red card, that means stop. but you don't need to stop in the middle of a sentence. You can finish your sentence. We're not that strict. Each candidate will have the opportunity to answer each question, and each candidate has 5 wild cards worth 30 seconds apiece to use as they wish, with the exception of adding on to their closing statements. So if you want to use your wild card, just get my attention, wave it, make sure I see it, and I thank you for that. As we said, please turn off your cell phones. There will be no filming. And I'm going to give you one chance to applaud, because after I introduce the candidates, no more applause, no booing, no heckling, no sound. We want to make sure we get every question answered. And I've been known to stop a debate if it gets out of hand. So we really want to hear from the candidates, so please, everyone, if you could hold all of your comments and applause until the end. And of course, I would be remiss as a League of Women Voters member if I didn't say that, as most of you know, we now have no female representatives in Congress. And I'm thrilled to say, come Election Day, we know we will have one. That was your applause. So as long as it's out of your system, if it's okay with everyone, we'll get to opening statements. Ms. Kim.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Pearl Kim, and as mentioned before, I'm running both in the 7th Congressional District and the current and the new 5th. So depending on where you live, you can actually vote twice. A little bit about myself. I'm a former special victims prosecutor. I spent a decade at Delaware County District Attorney's Office in the Special Victims Domestic Violence Division. I prosecuted rape cases, child physical and sexual abuse, internet crimes against children, and I went on to become the chief of the Human Trafficking Unit. What I was known for in law enforcement was I was able to secure the first human trafficking conviction in the state of Pennsylvania. I then went on to work with state legislators, both Republicans and Democrats, to expand protections for victims. And then I was able to secure the first human trafficking conviction under the new legislation. While I was at the DA's office, unfortunately, I ended up getting sick and battling cancer. That made me realize that life is really short. And so I wanted to effectuate greater change. So I went to work for our current Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, where I had the pleasure of leading the campus safety initiative across the Commonwealth. I worked on combating the opioid crisis, mental health, alcohol abuse, and campus sexual assaults. But as I was trekking across the Commonwealth, there was a recognition that a lot of the changes I wanted to actually make were federal. I never ever expected this position to open up, but when it did, I jumped for it. I'm now running not just 1, but 2 congressional districts. And a lot of it also stems from my own personal journey. I was very inspired by the Me Too movement. And I was frustrated with the current climate of Washington, the rhetoric coming out of Washington and politicians that could not work across the aisle for the common good. You see, when I was in college, I was actually a victim of a campus sexual assault. I went through the criminal justice system as a victim, and I was very displeased with my prosecutor. I was displeased with the criminal justice system, and I did not get the justice that I was seeking. And so that changed the course of my life, and I decided to become a special victims prosecutor. I was adamant to effectuate criminal justice reform, which I was able to do so, and I hope to have that opportunity in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon.
Okay. So when my children were small, there was this huge construction project at their elementary school. It was supposed to be completed by Labor Day, but as the summer days waned, parents got concerned that it wouldn't be finished and school wouldn't start on time. So we went to our administration and we're told, don't worry about it, everything's fine. And the school board didn't want to listen to our concerns. So one weekend, I grabbed a camera and I climbed over the construction fence. No one went with me, and I think it was probably trespassing, but what I found was a school that would not be ready for students to return for another 6 months. And that's when I ran for our school board. Over the next 10 years, I worked on that board and eventually was president. We had another 3 school renovation projects that we completed on time and on budget. We revamped our school lunch program, and we instituted cost controls so we could balance our budget while dealing with the massive school pension crisis that had been foisted upon the local districts by the state legislature. In my professional life, I've been a civil rights attorney for the last 35 years. For the last 15 years, I've led a legal services program at a national law firm, where it's been my privilege to supervise the donation of nearly $250 million worth of free legal services to people and organizations that would not otherwise be able to afford it. We've helped hundreds of thousands of veterans and voters and seniors and small businesses, people with disabilities, refugees, and nonprofits that make our communities better. But for the last 2 years, it's felt like I'm standing outside that construction fence again. The administration is telling us not to believe what we can see in front of our faces, and Congress isn't listening. So that's why I decided to climb over the fence again. This fence is taller, and I need your help to get over it. So that's why I'm asking for your vote on November 6th. Thank you.
Thank you. And just point of clarification, after I said what I said, I realized, I know you all knew what I was talking about. I was talking about in the Pennsylvania delegation, not Congress as a whole. So, with that said, get down to our first question for Ms. Kim, and questions are worth 1 minute. What is the primary reason that you want to be a congresswoman? What above all else do you want to do in Washington? And please be as specific as possible regarding policies you would advocate or action you would take. One minute.
That's a lot to answer.
You can speak as quickly as you want.
I shared again about my own personal journey, which really inspired me to want to run the Me Too movement. And again, my frustration with what was happening in Washington with politicians that could not work across the aisle for the common good. I have had the pleasure of working with both Republicans and Democrats. I was able to do it with expanding protections on the human trafficking legislation. I was appointed by both Governor Corbett and Governor Wolf to serve on the Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian American Affairs. And as I mentioned before, I worked for Democrat Attorney General Josh Shapiro. I believe very strongly in bipartisanship and having individuals work across the aisle. Ultimately, my priorities would be, again, to continue to combat sexual violence, domestic violence, human trafficking. The opioid crisis is a huge concern for me in this area and just for the nation at large. And last but certainly not least, I would like to make sure that we have a robust workforce development, we bring jobs, and comprehensive immigration reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Need a question repeated?
Sure.
Okay. In 1 minute, what is the primary reason that you want to be a congresswoman? What above all else do you want to do in Washington? Please be as specific as possible regarding policies you would advocate or action you would take.
So as I referenced in my opening, I'm not going to Washington to work on anything new. I mean, the issues I've been working on as a public interest lawyer are the issues I want to go to Washington for. It's just under the new administration and with what's going on in Congress, we're seeing the impact on the ground every day, particularly on issues involving immigration, issues involving public education, issues involving healthcare. So it's not a wish list of issues, it's the things I've been working on. As for some specific things I want to work on, I've signed on along with 107 other people running for Congress this year to make the first order of business of the new Congress to work on electoral and government reform, to work on 3 different areas: campaign finance reform, electoral reform, making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote can do so readily, and government ethics, making sure that those norms of government, which we thought were norms, like disclosing your tax returns, that those are now laws so that it actually happens. So that's the general area that I want to work on first. There's also specific things to this county. The Philadelphia Health Department has been trying to outlaw tobacco that is flavored with fruit because it's used to attract kids to become cigarette addicts. The Pennsylvania legislature has said that Philadelphia can't do that. Congress can trump, so to speak, the Pennsylvania legislature.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to our next topic. And this question, we'll start with Ms. Scanlon. What do you think of the Trump administration's approach to immigration? For example, the travel ban, border protection, and separating families. Please be specific and tell us how you would promote or legislate an immigration policy in Congress.
Sure. I think some of you have heard me talk about working on the travel ban the weekend that hit. I was organizing lawyers around the country to go to the airports, not to protest, but to file habeas petitions to help the people who followed all of our rules, but while they were in the air, the rules changed. We worked on that. Then we developed a manual for immigrant families, how to protect your families and your assets in case you're deported. Because if someone gets picked up while they're at work, nothing says that Customs and Border Patrol has to take care of the children who may be at school. It's clear our immigration policy is broken. Even people who are trying to follow it are unable to do so. So we do need to reform our immigration policy. And what we really need is for the Trump administration to stop turning it into a weapon, to turning it into an issue to divide our populace. There's nothing that says we can't have a humane immigration policy, and certainly the immigrants I've worked with over the last 15 years have been assets to our community, not threats.
Thank you, Ms. Kim.
Yes, as the daughter of immigrants, my parents came here from South Korea with next to nothing, and they're very proud, and they're in the audience right now. They came here in order to achieve the American dream, and because they were able to do so, I've had this amazing opportunity to pursue mine, which is public service. I've come out publicly that I do not agree with the administration's stance on immigration. I'm very pro-legal immigration. I think we need to have more legal avenues of immigration, not less. Certainly I believe in enforcement, but I think that there's a compassionate way of doing so. And I certainly do believe that we should be bringing in asylum and refugee seekers. We are the United States of America.
Thank you. Okay, next question, Ms. Kim, you will begin, and we'll skip over to the environment. With the effects of global warming becoming increasingly obvious, what is your position on the continued use of fossil fuels in the United States, and what policies would you work for in Congress pertaining to fossil fuels?
So first up, I think it's important that everyone recognize that I do believe in climate change. I do not agree that we should have withdrawn from the Paris Accord. I think we have a social responsibility to this generation and to future generations to make sure that we keep our environment safe and clean. That being said, I do also recognize that this area, Philadelphia in particular, has the potential to be an energy hub, but we have to diversify our portfolio and make sure that we integrate and bring in clean energy and move towards cleaner energy in general.
Thank you, Ms. Gale.
Certainly. As someone who grew up during the late 60s and early 70s when the EPA was created, I've certainly seen the impact of having a strong environmental protection policy. And I find it really disturbing that the Trump administration is seeking to gut it. Obviously, global warming is real, and simply scrubbing the data from the EPA's website doesn't negate that. We do need to transition to renewable energy, and the federal government can play a large role in doing that, whether we're developing alternative energy sources or helping promote transition. When I was on the school board, we did several school renovations. We would have loved to put in solar energy or other types of renewable energy, but it was too expensive. Our neighbors in New Jersey were able to do that because they had state funding for those projects. So there's a lot we can do through the federal government, and I would look forward to being a part of that.
Thank you. And Ms. Scanlon, the next question, you will begin. I can relate to this question. Okay, whoever it was from the audience says, my health insurance premiums have increased 120% since 2015. Specifically, what will you do in Congress to stop and reverse this trend?
So we have the Affordable Care Act, which the overwhelming majority of Americans favor. We've seen health insurance premiums increase radically because of efforts by this administration to undermine that act, removing the individual mandate and filing lawsuits to try to have the whole act declared unconstitutional. Look, the Affordable Care Act wasn't perfect, but it was the right idea, and we helped millions of Americans. We helped 70,000 people right here in the new 5th District. So we need to repair the damage that's been done to that act and then move forward with genuine negotiation of pharmaceutical prices, not by piggybacking on foreign countries, but by having Medicare negotiate those prices itself and moving towards a public option.
As a cancer survivor, I certainly believe that we need to have universal health care. I don't think that any parent should lose their home if their children get sick. That being said, I also don't agree with repealing the Affordable Care Act until we have something in place. I disagree with my opponent in terms of how to fund that. I don't believe a single-payer system would work in practice. I do believe that we need a hybrid system of both a public-private partnership. I would have concerns with the government running our health care. If we take a look at the VA, we can see the inefficiencies and the blatant concerns of the government running that. And so that's where I stand on health care.
Thank you. Okay. 30 seconds.
Sure. I would just clarify that I did not indicate that I was promoting a single-payer healthcare system at this time. I'm hearing for the first time what my opponent's positions are on many of these issues, and she seems to be running against the Republican Party's position, which I understand because I am as well.
Okay. Ms. Kim, this next question will begin with you. And this is a long one. I will repeat the key points. And regarding our military. The U.S. has troops on the ground, or has had troops on the ground in the Middle East for almost 18 years. Our military is currently involved in 170 nations. We spent $600 billion on our military policy in 2017, 54% of the U.S. budget. And we spend 3 times more than the 7 other highest spending nations combined. If elected, would you continue to support a similar worldwide military presence, or do you see another role for the U.S. in our military? Please elaborate.
1 minute.
Do you need to repeat it? The end, anyway. Okay.
I don't think we can afford to be the world's police. That being said, I think it is really important that we maintain our global relationships, that we support economic freedom in other countries, that we work towards humanitarian rights and so forth. In terms of military spending, I think the most important thing is to make sure that every dollar that we spend actually goes to supporting our troops and not to any other types of programs that might not be productive or, in essence, useful directly to the military and support our troops.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, you know, Congress in recent years in particular has taken a really, has taken the knives out for our domestic spending and has really made people work to get every dollar for legal services, for Medicare, for Social Security, for all the things that help people here at home. But it hasn't taken the same level of scrutiny to our military budget. Last year, as part of the big tax package at the end of the year, they gave the military so much money, the military had to ask for a waiver because they couldn't spend it all in 1 year. So we need to take a closer look at our military spending. Obviously, we need to make sure that when we're sending troops overseas and into harm's way, we need to support them and make sure that they have the equipment and the support that they need. But we do need to take a closer look at what appears to be out-of-control spending by the military-industrial complex.
Thank you. Next question, we're going to move on to gun violence. And question will begin with Ms. Scanlon. What is your position on prioritizing common sense gun control laws? How will you reach across the aisle in Congress to protect Americans from gun violence?
Well, this is an issue I've been on the record for almost 20 years. I have a front page Delco Times newspaper article when I took some of the people here on buses down to the Million Mile March. I'm all for common sense gun control measures. I grew up in northern New York where my father and my sister and many of our relatives hunted for food. So I'm not saying let's take away everyone's guns. I'm saying there's room for common sense. And in that, I have an unusual ally for me. Justice Scalia recognized in the Heller decision that there is room for common sense gun safety measures. And there's no one size fits all. There are some things we need to do to deal with mass shootings like Parkland and the Pulse Club and San Bernardino, and all of these shootings we've seen. We need to reauthorize the assault weapons ban. We need to ban high-capacity magazines. But we also need to address the steady violence that grips cities like Chester and Philly. And we need to have common sense, public health type solutions there. We need research, which the federal government has banned. We need research to show us how we can do that better.
I respect the Second Amendment, but I do support the red flag legislation that has been proposed across the state of Pennsylvania. And that is, you can petition the court if you or a select amount of individuals, whether it's law enforcement or immediate family, believes that a person could be an immediate threat to themselves and or others. I think that that's an effective piece of legislation. I think that there's no due process concerns as a result of that. It has been deemed effective to reduce suicides. We don't have enough data in terms of how to really predict an active shooter type of situation, but certainly some of the situations that we have seen, there were some red flags exhibited, so I do think that this piece of legislation will be effective. But that being said, I do think it is important that we focus on our district. The city of Chester has the highest murder per capita in the state of Pennsylvania. It was also named one of the second murder capitals in America. And I agree, we do need to do some sort of research. Why are the youth in Chester have more access to guns than they do computers?
Thank you. 30 seconds.
I just wanted to mention that I did get an F from the NRA, which I am really, really proud. My opponent got a question mark, so I'm learning about her positions on this tonight for the first time.
Okay. And just to mix things up a little bit, I'm going to throw in a lightning round question. 30 seconds or less. If elected, which committees would you like to be in? And Ms. Kim, you start this round.
I think the judiciary would certainly be of interest to me, but also I see the potential of being on transportation and infrastructure. When you're looking at the 5th Congressional District, we have the entire Philadelphia International Airport in our district. We are certainly positioned in an ideal place to make sure that our infrastructure and transportation would be extremely effective in boosting our economy. And what most people actually do not realize is that my former specialty of combating human trafficking, where there are transportation hubs, there are human trafficking, and so I would also be able to make a difference in that.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Interestingly, I'm also interested in judiciary. So judiciary is where many of the voting rights issues come. And we have been looking at Pennsylvania better than anyone knows about voter suppression issues because we've been subjected to gerrymandering, strict voter ID, and other means of suppressing the vote. It's also where immigration resides, and that is also an interest as I've been working in that arena for 15 years. Finally, that's where legal services resides, and there are other investigatory opportunities with judiciary.
Thank you. And Ms. Scanlon, this next question starts with you. Public education has been a long-standing local and state responsibility. What is the role of the federal government with regard to education? And what specific measures related to public education would you make a priority upon your election?
So public education is a local and state responsibility, and Pennsylvania schools have more problems than most because we have a very broken school funding system here. The 5th district is interesting in that we have 3 of the best school districts in the state and probably 3 with the biggest challenges. When I worked at the Education Law Center for a decade, I represented families in every one of the 19 school districts that make up the new 5th Congressional District. So I'm really aware of the issues. There are really specific things that the federal government can do. It could fully fund the special ed law that it passed 40 years ago. That would even out a lot of the disparities between school districts in this state. It could also do a better job with Title I funding, because that provides extra funding to low-income students. And there have been some issues with how that's targeted. Other things that we could do have to do with secondary education, doing a better job with making more opportunities, not just college available, but vocational and technical education, so people have a whole range of job prospects.
I don't believe that anyone's education should be determined by their zip code, so I am happy to see that the state is working on a new school formula to properly fund our schools. I am for pro-choice in terms of schools, and so I recognize that there are some excellent charter schools, but I also recognize that there are some bad charter schools, and so there needs to be a level of transparency and accountability with those charter schools. And I think the biggest concern that we are going to be seeing is the college debt. And so I feel strongly about what the Attorney General's office has been doing by going after predatory lending and making sure that our students are not drowning in debt. We also have to educate our high school students with the recognition and destigmatize that maybe college is not for everyone, and making sure we find the right pathway for each individual student.
30 seconds, please.
I would just note that with respect to student debt, yes, Attorney General Josh Shapiro here in Pennsylvania is going after predatory lenders. I've worked with Josh as my opponent, and that's why I'm so pleased to have his endorsement. But our federal government is not going after predatory lenders. In fact, Betsy DeVos has rolled back protections from predatory student loans and is rolling back protections for students who attend for-profit universities, such as Trump University, that do not confer any benefit that will allow them to pay off the loans that they've received.
Okay, 30 seconds.
I also have concerns with Betsy DeVos. Not only has she rolled back in terms of that, but also in terms of Title IX and protecting students for campus sexual assaults. It is very important to me, especially with my own personal story, that students are protected on college campuses. Not only do we have to continue to support our Title IX process, but colleges and universities should also be promoting the criminal justice response.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Kim, you start this next round, and it's on campaign finance. 90% of Americans feel that corporate and special interest money corrupts our political process. What would you do to curb the undue influence of money in politics and over our politicians?
Yeah, I think it's completely frustrating how much money goes into political elections. And the biggest donor to my campaign is me, myself, and I. And so I certainly think that we need comprehensive reform of campaign finance in general. Another statistic is for women of color. It's statistically more difficult for women of color to raise money. And I think we need some sort of reform so that qualified individuals have the ability to run for political office. Right now, I am funded by myself, my friends, my family, and immigrants.
Scanlon.
Thank you. Well, we do agree that we need significant campaign finance reform. I didn't know Senator Toomey was one of your family friends. So women have a much harder time raising money through campaign finance. And it's not just because we have a wage gap, but we also have a wealth gap. Women on average have 30% of the wealth of men. That makes it much more difficult to raise money for a political campaign. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with Represent PA to raise money for women running for office in Pennsylvania. It's a necessary thing we need to do, but it's also why, Is our campaign finance system broken? Yes, it absolutely is. That's why I've signed on to this pledge to make that the first order of business in the new Congress, and why I've been endorsed by Citizens United.
30 seconds.
I do appreciate Senator Toomey's support, along with the local Republicans that have supported my campaign. But let's be very real. This is Pearl Kim versus Ballard Sparr.
Okay. Moving on. Moving on. The next question. Can you tell us your thoughts on criminal justice reform?
Certainly. That's another area that I've been working on over the last 15 years. Under President Obama, there was a rare bipartisan moment where the Koch brothers agreed with the Obama Justice Department. And that was on the issue of mandatory sentencing and what it had done to explode our prison population, creating mass incarceration. So my colleagues and I worked with the administration to help individuals who are nonviolent, usually low-level drug offenders who'd served significant time, apply for presidential clemency. And we managed to obtain clemency for 29 individuals. One of them is the subject of a feature Sundance film that premiered on HBO this month. It's called The Sentence. And it just gives you an upfront look at the devastating effect of mass incarceration on individuals and families. So I've worked in that arena. I've worked to help citizens returning from incarceration to get jobs, to get their sentences expunged. It is an area of great interest for me, and it's something I look forward to working on in Congress.
Thank you.
I spent my legal career working on criminal justice reform. As I mentioned to you before, I was able to secure the first human trafficking conviction in the state of Pennsylvania. I worked with state legislators to expand protections for victims, and then I was able to secure the first human trafficking conviction under the new legislation. And not only is that just purely lawyering, a lot of it had a lot more to do with consensus building, mobilizing local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and the community, and also getting resources behind an issue that no one was looking at, and executing and getting something done. I've also, been able to work on equal access for justice across the Commonwealth. And that is for individuals, for example, that English might be their second language, making sure that they have access to interpreters, whether you're a victim or a defendant. If you do not understand what is happening in the courtroom, how can you get equal access to justice? So several stakeholders from across the state, we worked together. We proposed something to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, which was adopted, and other initiatives as well, such as working and dealing with underserved communities and bringing attention and highlighting their various issues.
Thank you. Moving on to question 11, and we'll start with Ms. Kim. And this is regarding communication with your constituents. And the question is, what methods will you use to communicate with your constituents? Will you meet with them, a town hall style meeting? Tell us how you want to communicate with your constituents if elected.
Yeah, I think it's very important to engage with your constituents. I mean, this is again the reason why I'm running, because I recognize fully what it feels like when the government isn't working for you. When I was a victim in my particular case, I did not feel like the prosecutor on my case truly heard me and dealt with me as an actual human being, but it was more of a job to her. And so I feel very strongly in making sure that all the individuals and constituents have access to me. I resigned from the Attorney General's office when I decided to run for this position. I have been campaigning full time. And I think, like I said, through whether it's social media, whether it's through press, whether it's through meetings in the office, I will be open to meeting with everyone. Unfortunately, my opponent has canceled some debates previously, and I apologize that I wasn't able to engage with you on those various forums.
I find that interesting. I'm unaware of any debates that we canceled. And in fact, over the course of this campaign, I've engaged in over 20 forums and debates, some of which my opponent was invited to but did not attend. I even was at one at her alma mater with her just a couple weeks ago. So I haven't canceled any debates. With respect to communication with the electorate, we've found it really fascinating through this campaign to see the different ways that people engage. So we've had a texting program to text with millennials who prefer to receive information that way. We've sent out hard copy to, shall we say, more mature members who would like to receive information that way. We've done emails, we've had social media, we've done videos, and I would expect all of that to continue if I'm fortunate enough to be elected to office. I've also committed to doing quarterly town halls.
You're testing me, aren't you? Okay, this next question, question 12, we'll start with Ms. Scanlon. How do you plan to protect the rights of children and adults with disabilities in terms of existing and future legislation?
I mean, this is an arena I've been working in for over 20 years. The Education Law Center of Pennsylvania was formed to represent the rights of children and families in the schools, and much of that work centered around making sure that children with disabilities could receive a free, appropriate public education, making sure they could get the special education services that they needed. In addition to work I did through that agency, which included class actions, individual representation, appointment to 2 statewide commissions to implement disability legislation throughout the state. I've also worked on adult disability issues, whether it's access to housing and work, or services such as making sure there's community-based housing as opposed to institutional. So I would continue those efforts in Congress.
I too have spent my career protecting children. When I was a Special Victims Domestic Violence Division, I worked with a lot of children, unfortunately, with both physical and intellectual disabilities. As you can only imagine, dealing with these types of crimes, it's very often that the most vulnerable are unfortunately subject to some of this. And so I devoted my career to working with these children, working with the schools locally, whether it be the city of Chester and or other schools, and making sure and ensuring that these children were getting the proper education and that they weren't being disadvantaged at their various schools. I certainly hope that this school formula that the state is working on will also help enhance and fund the schools appropriately.
Next question, we'll begin with Ms. Kim. Can you tell us your position on the Affordable Care Act regarding pre-existing conditions, reproductive rights, access to quality health care for all, and would you repeal, reform, or keep as is?
Yeah, I think I answered this previously. Like I mentioned before, I'm not interested in repealing the Affordable Care Act until we have appropriate system in place. That being said, certainly as a cancer survivor, I am here to protect pre-existing conditions. And again, like I mentioned before, I think that ultimately a hybrid system of a public-private partnership would ultimately work. But I certainly think that we need to continue to look and make sure we make the appropriate changes.
Could you repeat the question? There were several parts.
Sure. What is your position on the Affordable Care Act regarding pre-existing conditions, reproductive rights, access to quality health care, and would you repeal, reform, or keep as is?
I think I did say earlier that I'm very interested in reforming or repairing the Affordable Care Act and then extending it so that we can achieve universal health coverage. One of its great benefits has been coverage for pre-existing conditions, which affect so many people here and throughout the country. With respect to reproductive rights that I think my opponent didn't mention, I think we absolutely need to make sure that women have access to the full range of reproductive rights, whether that's access to abortion, access to affordable and accessible health care, or birth control. We need the federal government to refund the teen pregnancy programs that were cut by the Trump administration, and we need to address maternal mortality, which is higher in this country by 2 to 3 times than the rest of the developed world, and is getting worse.
Thank you. Next question, Ms. Scanlon, we'll begin with you. The U.S. deficit is higher than ever. Some have suggested cutting Social Security and Medicare to address this. Do you agree with this approach? If so, why? And if not, how would you propose controlling the federal deficit?
Really? The deficit is higher? How did that happen? Oh my goodness! Could it have been the tax bill last year that was a $1.5 trillion giveaway to corporations and high-income individuals, permanent giveaway to those people, with the thought that maybe this time trickle-down economics will work? I think we need to roll back those tax cuts because it has created this false scenario where we have this huge deficit that now we're going to have to address by, oh no, cutting Social Security and Medicare, Paul Ryan's favorite entitlements. So I would have a different approach. I think when we're in a time with a growing economy, we should have a tax policy that works to reduce income inequality as opposed to exacerbating it.
I certainly agree with protecting our Social Security. While I was at the Attorney General's office, I also supervised the Elder Protection Unit. I recognize particularly in Pennsylvania, I believe we have the third highest percentage of elders in Pennsylvania. And so I devoted my work also to protecting seniors. In terms of the deficit, wasteful spending is something that we need to take a look at. My concern is that sometimes a lot of these programs are just simply on autopilot. No one is really assessing the programs and going in and determining whether the outcomes are what we were seeking in the first place.
Thank you. And the next question, how would you work to promote diversity and inclusion in Congress and in your district? And Ms. Kim, we start with you.
Well, first of all, there has never been a woman of color elected into Congress in the history of Pennsylvania. And so by me putting my name in the hat, I'm already changing the narrative of that and changing the narrative of politics. And I think that that's very important. Of course, I have devoted my entire legal career to diversity and inclusion. As I mentioned before, I served on the Governor's Advisory Commission on Asian American Affairs. I'm also on the board of directors for the Asian Pacific American Bar Association. We work with affiliate bar associations such as the Hispanic Bar Association, the Barristers Bar Association, and other various associations to make sure that we worked on diversity and inclusion. And also in my different roles, whether it was at the District Attorney's Office or the Attorney General's Office, I was often designated as a liaison in order to be able to serve our underserved communities.
Thank you.
I would look to the work I've done over my whole career. I mean, working at the Education Law Center, that was working on inclusion of people with disabilities. For the last 15 years, I've led a program at Constitution High School in Philadelphia. It's a magnet school in Philadelphia, where the idea is to help kids from throughout the city who are interested in becoming lawyers to explore the profession. Working with Represent PA, I've been trying to get more women into the state legislature. This summer, we've had on our campaign, we had an internship program bringing in kids from throughout the districts of various ethnicities and gender to work on a political campaign along with a program called Democracy Summer. So working on diversity issues has been part of what I've been doing my whole career, and I would expect to continue to do so. And one major way to do that is by legislating for public funding for campaigns. It's been shown in the states that have adopted it that public funding for political campaigns helps increase diversity.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Ms. Scanlon. How will you address the opioid crisis in our country?
I think there's probably not a person here who hasn't been affected by the opioid crisis in some way. It is overwhelming, it's insidious, it's everywhere. We've experienced it in my family. I have a young nephew who became addicted to heroin, and if it weren't for Narcan, he wouldn't be with us now. So, in conversations with him, in conversations with medical professionals, we need to limit the harm right now. We need to look at safe injection sites. We need to make sure Narcan is readily available, but we really need to make sure that there's medical coverage and beds for people who are ready for treatment so they can get into treatment when they're ready to treat, and that they can stay as long as they need to.
I don't believe safe injection sites are the way to go, nor do I believe that that is legal. I think the better way to approach this, number one, is to fund prevention. There's such a thing called trauma-informed care that I hope to see in a lot of the Pennsylvania schools, where you get to the root and the source of a problem so that students perhaps will not turn to alcohol and or drugs. In addition to that, I certainly believe that addiction is a disease, that we need to have treatment, but we need to find better treatment and make sure that there is better access to treatment. I also agree with what has been happening in law enforcement in terms of making sure that we are going after the big pharma, taking a look at them, and certainly I do believe that in terms of prosecuting traffickers should continue.
Thank you. And Ms. Kim, I'm going to throw in a question here. Tell us something that we don't know about you that we haven't heard on the campaign trail. Could be fun.
Well, as I mentioned that unfortunately in college I was the victim of a campus sexual assault, but actually I was a fine arts major at Haverford. I graduated from Bryn Mawr College and majored at Haverford. And just completely random fun fact, I have an art studio in my condo.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon, what don't we know about you?
I tell you about our chickens, but they've been in a video. Same with the rescue dogs. I tell you I won a disco dance contest when I was 20, but we have a disco video too. I learned to drive an outboard boat when I was 6 years old.
Now you two are lawyers, right? Okay, we're not going there. And thank you both for humoring us. We are at that point of the program for closing statements. Closing statements are 2 minutes each, and as agreed upon, Ms. Scanlon, we will begin with you.
I want to thank the League of Women Voters and the NAACP for arranging this tonight. An hour's not that long, so if you have any questions about my positions or my background, please go to scanlonforcongress.com and you can look things up. You can also find your polling place, look up your voter registration, and if you need an absentee ballot, you can get it there too, but the deadline's October 30th. We were looking at campaign photos the other night, and I found one that's my favorite. I wanted to share it with you. Can't show it literally because we can't have props, but it was a picture of my husband and my 3 kids and I going to the polling place, our polling place, on May 15th. And it was important to me for 2 reasons. The first is, I'm a mom, I'm usually on the other side of the camera, and I don't have very many pictures of me with my whole family. But the second reason is, it has to do with instilling the values you want to see in your children. I've been taking my children with me to that same polling place for the last 24 years for every election. We've gone when they were in strollers and in diapers, and we've gone when it was raining, and they've helped me push the buttons, and we've talked about the issues. With apologies to my youngest, I dragged him to the polling place when he had his wisdom teeth out and an ice pack on his face because it was the first time he could vote. But I wanted them to know there's certain things in life that are non-negotiable. You have to brush your teeth, you have to be nice to your neighbors, and you have to vote. If you're here tonight, I think you understand how important voting is. And the stakes in this election are so high. Congress is not doing its job. It's not legislating in a way to help the people in this district. And it's not acting as a check on the worst impulses of the Trump administration, an administration that has shown that it wants to roll back decades of progress in expanding medical care, environmental protection, civil rights, international relations, everything. So that's why November 6th, it's time to climb over the fence. And this time, I hope we go together.
Ms. Kim, you have 2 minutes for your closing
Sure,
statement.
thank you. Again, I want to thank the League of Women Voters, the NAACP for hosting it, for Mary Gay Scanlon for being here, and all of you taking the time to actually listen to us and learn about our candidacy. But what I want to leave you with is a couple things. Number one, I was an agent of change in Pennsylvania. As I mentioned to you before, I was able to implement historic criminal justice reform here in Pennsylvania, and I certainly hope to have that opportunity to do so in Washington. Number two, what I also want to leave you with is that a very unique perspective, not only for this district, but for the Commonwealth and for this nation. I am the daughter of immigrants. There has never been a woman of color elected into Congress in the history of Pennsylvania. And with the current climate and the Me Too climate, the fact that I was a sexual assault survivor, a former special victims prosecutor, it is really time to have someone with that type of perspective in our government so that we can change our institutions. This all goes to my own personal story, which I told you before. When I was a victim, the prosecutor on my case treated it as nothing more than a job. She forgot what it was to be a true public servant, that the government is here to work for us. And I strongly believe that that is my life story. I am running to change the narrative. I am running to shake up both establishments, both Republicans and Democrats, and remind everyone that the government is supposed to work for us. I was a fierce advocate for the victims in my courtroom, and I will be a fierce advocate for you in Washington. Please go out and vote Pearl Kim. Thank you.
Pearl Kim, Mary Gay Scanlon, and I want to thank you for being such a wonderful audience. So now another round of applause for everyone, please.